You stand on the cold stone steps of the Senate House while Rome is not yet fully awake. Leather sandals skim across marble like muffled knocks. The smell of burning resin, damp wool, and old incense smoke blends into an air that feels both sacred and stifling. An official holds a wax tablet as if he were holding an order not yet spoken aloud. Morning light slips across the tablet's edge, then glides over the columns, over shoulders draped in cloth, over faces that know they are standing inside the visible field of power. In Rome, people were not ruled by soldiers alone. They were ruled by the feeling that everything had already been placed in its proper order before you arrived. Temples, rites, offices, oaths, the gaze of the crowd, all of it gathered into a single invisible pressure. It did not need to shout. It only needed to make you lower your voice. And that is when you understood, in Rome, the strongest form of power often lay not in the hand gripping the sword, but in the hand permitted to touch the sacred. The bronze tablet hanging outside the forum catches the light like a public screen from the ancient world. The words carved into it are not there merely to be read. They remind everyone that belief in Rome was never entirely a private matter. The Romans pushed public religion into the center of shared life very early on. Feast days, oaths, sacrifice, the rhythm of the square, even what was permitted to be done before the eyes of the community. Religio publica therefore meant more than belief in the gods. It was the way the state turned belief into an atmosphere that covered collective action. Rome did not need everyone to feel the same. It only needed everyone to move in the same rhythm. Once ritual was tied to office and law, legitimacy no longer depended entirely on one individual. One magistrate could die. One faction could fall. But the form remained long enough to begin looking natural. A ringed hand pauses above a document, and the silence around that gesture reveals that knowledge was never harmless. In Rome, one of the groups that held the most dangerous kind of knowledge was the pontifices, the most important priestly college of all. They did not merely oversee sacrifices. They controlled jus divinum, the sacred law governing the relationship between the community and the gods recognized by the state. In other words, they held the key to a vital question: what counted as right in the eyes of the gods, and therefore right in the eyes of Rome? If a small group controlled the festival calendar, the formulas of ritual, and the limits of what could be said or done, then they were controlling the very breathing rhythm of legitimacy itself. The crowd could see the monument, but not everyone was allowed to touch the language that gave that monument the right to stand there. Sunlight crawls slowly across the sundial. Down in the streets, merchants, litigants, officials, creditors, and those waiting for judgment are all held by what seems like a small question. Are public actions allowed today or not? Rome answered that question through the fasti, the sacred calendar marking which days legal business could proceed. Some days you could open your mouth in court. Some days everything had to stop. Some days the square moved. Some days the whole city seemed forced to lower its pulse. On the surface, it was only a calendar. But in truth, it was the power to decide when society was permitted to move. If you control the rhythm of days, you do not merely control time. You control opportunity, delay, pressure, and even the possibility of resistance. When markets, courts, and ritual all followed the same clock, power ceased to be a moment. It became a way of life. A seal presses into soft wax. A tiny indentation appears, yet the feeling it leaves behind is much larger. The Romans understood that public commands did not live by writing alone. They lived by the aura surrounding the writing. One word that helped create that aura was numen, the invisible nod of divine force, an approval that did not need to appear in visible form in order to make people hesitate. That was one of Rome's subtler moves. They did not always need to say, "Obey because I am strong." Sometimes all they had to suggest was that this command did not stand alone. It stood within the light of something sacred. Once a decision was felt to carry a nod from beyond visible sight, resistance changed even before threats were spoken. Power then did not merely press from the outside. It slipped inward, turning hesitation into silence. On a carved stone slab, a promise can look dry and brief, but in the Roman world, it could carry nearly the weight of a contract with the gods. The Romans called that kind of conditional vow a votum. I will offer a gift, build a temple, or perform a certain act if I receive the favor I seek. This was not the kind of feeling that rises and fades. It was an agreement spoken within the sight of the community and the divine. Once what was hoped for had been granted, The one who made the vow was bound to fulfill what had been promised. That is what gives Roman ritual its cold, lucid tone. Belief was not always opposed to calculation. On the contrary, in Rome, belief often moved alongside the logic of reciprocal obligation. You prayed, but you also committed yourself. You hoped to be helped, but accepted that help would bind you afterward. The Temple of Saturn stands heavy in the Forum like a block of stone that knows how to keep secrets. It was not only a place of worship. Beneath the dignity of that temple, Rome once placed the aerarium, the public treasury, along with records and the financial flow of the state. During the Republic, it was managed by the quaestors and remained under senatorial oversight. That arrangement alone reveals a deeply Roman instinct for power. They did not want public wealth protected only by thick walls. They wanted it wrapped in reverence. When money, documents, and public prestige all lay inside a sacred space, violation ceased to be simple theft. It touched something close to the untouchable. People were not afraid only of being caught. They were afraid they had stepped into a zone they should never have touched. The sound of coins striking one another is small, dry, almost emotionless. But behind that sound lies one of Rome's secrets. Belief could make wealth move faster. Temples in the ancient world were not only places of prayer. They also attracted deposits, guarded property, and could be connected to lending or the circulation of resources, because people trusted them to be safer, harder to violate, and covered in a prestige greater than ordinary life. The logic is simple. Wherever something is considered most trustworthy, capital flows there. Rome understood that deeply. Once the sacred stood behind the credibility of wealth, religion no longer remained at the edge of material life. It entered directly into the circulation of resources. When assets, trust, and public authority overlapped, what you saw was no longer three separate things. You were looking at the backbone of order itself. Before the altar, the smell of smoke and hot fat swirls together. Yet beneath that scene lies a very clear logic. Dude, I give so that you may give in return. Roman religion did not operate mainly through emotional surrender. It operated through the idea of exchange bound by obligation. People offered sacrifice, spoke the correct formulas, completed the rite, and then waited for a response in the form of peace, victory, harvest, or protection. Put more plainly, Rome was used to thinking that a bond held only when both sides fulfilled their part. That explains why Roman belief sounds both sacred and practical. The same logic could echo into politics. The state gives protection, the people give obedience. Office grants benefits, the holder of office must prove worthy. The community gives loyalty, power must return order. When that feeling of reciprocity breaks, trust fractures. Herd animals move toward the altar in a heavy, ordered line, and many modern people see only display. Rome saw another layer: food supply, distribution, and the way ritual could reach the stomachs of the crowd. In Roman sacrificial practice, the extra were offered to the gods, while the meat meant for earthly consumption could be shared with participants, enter public meals, or move on into market circulation. Modern scholarship and ancient sources alike suggest that sacrificial meat did not simply vanish into incense and smoke. It often moved forward into material life. This was one of Rome's coldest moves. They did not let ritual live only as a symbol. They tied it to fullness, to supply, and to the fact that a crowded city kept eating. A power that touches dinner has a deeper hold than a power that only appears on the speaker's platform. The smell of roasted meat still hangs in the air. The sound of knives striking the block comes in short, dry beats, like the pulse of a city that is not allowed to stop eating. After the ritual, the remaining meat does not disappear into smoke. It moves on into the Macellum, Rome's food market, where meat and fish pass straight into ordinary life. Evidence on Roman markets shows that the Macellum was a central space in the urban circulation of food. This reveals a cold truth. Rome did not allow ritual to end at the altar. It pulled ritual into the market, into meals, into the rhythm of mass consumption. Once the sacred touches supply, trust stops being a matter confined to temples. It becomes habit. And a power that slips into the evening meal of the people will always be more durable than a power that simply stands on stone steps issuing commands. Salt wind lashes across the deck. Cages rattle sharply. Every eye turns toward the sacred chickens that refuse to peck at the grain. Before the Battle of Drepana in 249 BCE, tradition says that Publius Claudius Pulcher ignored that omen and went on to disaster. Classical sources and modern reference works alike preserve the story as one of Rome's most striking examples of divination in war. But the story survived not only because it was strange. It gave Rome a way to explain defeat without shattering trust in the ruling class itself. If catastrophe could be pushed into the claim that something had been done wrongly before the gods, then the larger order could still appear fundamentally sound. That is the real power of omen reading. It does not merely begin in action. It absorbs the shock after failure, allowing the community to go on believing that the structure of power itself is not rotten at the root. Flour dust clings to the hands of the man distributing grain. Elsewhere, cheers crash down from the stands like waves. Rome understood something every great city eventually learns. Crowds cannot be held by law alone. They must be fed, drawn into a shared rhythm, and given the feeling that they have not been abandoned. That is where the phrase panem et circenses, bread and spectacles, comes in, used to describe the way power calmed discontent through food and public entertainment. The important point is that Rome did not merely distribute. It turned distribution into a public scene. A loaf of bread quieted hunger. A day of games eased an overheated mind. When both moved together, power began to resemble care more than repression. Many great orders do not endure because everyone loves them. They endure because too many people still feel they are being sustained by something. Soldiers' boots strike the ground in a single rhythm. In the middle of the ranks, an oath comes out short, hard, and unsoftened. The Romans called it the sacramentum. In Roman tradition, the word became tied to the soldier's oath of loyalty, binding him not only to his commander, but also to something sacred. Modern scholarship treats it as a core part of Roman military discipline. Once sworn, obedience was no longer a matter of convenience. It became a bond touching honor, the body, and the fear of betraying one's own spoken word. That is why Roman military law carried a special chill. An army was not held together by pay alone. It was held together by the feeling that retreating at the wrong moment was not merely a tactical mistake. It was a tearing apart of a promise already placed under divine sight. And a promise once spoken could never be taken back intact. Spearheads flash cold under the sun. The ranks stand packed like a breathing wall. But behind that order lies an unpleasant truth. An army that marches far, suffers hunger, cold, and bloodshed cannot survive if each man chooses for himself when to advance or retreat. Rome understood that very early. That is why desertion, cowardice, or disobedience in the military could be punished with extreme severity. Discipline was not designed to save an individual. It was designed to keep the whole formation from breaking apart. That is why Roman military discipline sank into the bone. It did not ask you to be brave. It forced you to understand the price of not being brave. Once everyone believes that a single step back at the wrong moment can drag the whole line toward death, obedience becomes reflex. And that reflex is one of the things that carried Rome far beyond its own borders. The face of the stone statue does not change under blazing sun or cold wind, as if Rome had long distrusted emotions that showed themselves too openly. Out of that suspicion rises pietas, a quality often understood as proper devotion to the gods, the fatherland, and one's parents. Modern reference works describe pietas as a central Roman moral value, linked more to duty than to impulsive feeling. The crucial point is that pietas does not celebrate a beautiful emotion that flares up and vanishes. It prizes endurance, right measure, and the ability to do one's part even when the heart resists. That made it perfectly suited to Roman power. A community that wants to last cannot rest on mood. It has to rest on people who know how to lock themselves into obligation. Once virtue is defined by endurance and loyalty to something greater than self, power gains a very strong foundation. The father's gaze remains fixed before the crowd, colder than the executioner's blade. Tradition says that Lucius Junius Brutus, after helping overthrow the last king and open a republic, condemned his own sons to death for plotting to restore the house of Tarquin. However much the story bears the marks of foundation legend, Rome preserved it as a political moral standard. What makes it haunting is not cruelty alone. It is the demand Rome wanted to carve into collective memory. At certain moments, the state must stand above blood ties. If the family, the nearest bond of all, can still be cut in order to save public order, then very little remains that may claim to stand above the law. Here, power does not ask to be loved. It demands priority. And once a community accepts that demand, It also accepts living under a standard so cold that turning back becomes almost impossible. Sacred grass, woolen bands, and solemn formulas stand at the border like a pause before violence. Rome had a priestly diplomatic body called the Officiales, associated with treaties, declarations of war, and foreign procedures considered proper before gods and community alike. Modern scholarship describes them as important in giving war the appearance of ritual legitimacy. That matters greatly. A war is always easier to accept when it is presented as having passed through the correct steps, words, and forms. That is why war in Rome did not appear merely as naked ambition. It was dressed in procedure and justification. This is a sharp art of power. Do not merely do what you want. Build a stage on which what you want looks like what had to be done. Once violence itself passes through ritual, the community sees less greed and more right. The spear is hurled across the boundary not like a burst of anger, but like the final mark in a chain of demands already spoken aloud. Here emerges the idea of bellum iustum, a just war, or at least a war presented as one. In Roman tradition, war was easier to accept when framed as a response to insult, treaty violation, or the refusal of justice. This did not make war less bloody, but it changed the voice through which blood was explained. That is the disturbing talent of power, not to erase violence, but to change the way violence enters memory. Once a community believes it is fighting the right war, it will endure losses longer and resist more slowly. Many empires endure not only because they strike hard. They endure because they tell the story of their blow more skillfully. And once that story takes root, it can outlive the battlefield itself. In the corner of the house, a small flame casts light on the lararium, the household shrine where the Laras and Penates guard the peace of the home, its stored food, and its daily habits. Sources on Roman religion describe the lararium as the space of family worship, while the Laras and Penates are tied to the protection of the household and its provisions. That means that even in the most private room, Rome placed a sacred order in the middle of meals and ancestral memory. This is where power begins in its quietest form. A child watches adults offer incense. The child learns that the house has ranks, reverence, and things that must not be treated lightly. From that room, the habit of obedience moves outward into the street, the square, and the ranks. A durable order does not wait until people enter public life before teaching them to bow. It begins at the table, at the small flame, in gestures repeated until they feel natural. Two consular chairs stand level in slanting light, neither set higher than the other. That image alone speaks of one of Rome's deepest fears. Do not let one man remain too long at the highest point. After the age of kings, the Romans divided power among many hands. The Senate held memory and prestige. Magistrates handled administration. Priests held the sacred side of public life. No one was allowed to embrace the whole of power alone. That arrangement did not make Rome less conflict-ridden. It simply forced conflict to pass through more gates. And it was precisely those points of obstruction that helped forge legitimacy. A durable order does not last because it has no disputes. It lasts because the ambition of each individual is forced to slow down and move through limits that already existed before him. The lituus rises lightly. A patch of sky that seemed empty is suddenly divided into what is favorable and what must be approached with caution. That is the moment the augur appears. They did not merely watch birds or clouds to predict tomorrow. Their work was to read signs and determine whether the gods approved of a public action. In Roman life, the reading of auspices could delay procedure, block decisions, and force power itself to stop before moving forward. The unsettling thing is that Rome turned the sky into a soft but very real barrier. Not every decision was halted by shouted protest. Some were stopped simply because the signs did not open the way. That is an ancient lesson that still feels new. Sometimes all it takes is a community that believes there is an invisible boundary no one should cross too quickly. In the middle of the forum, a single shout could heat the crowd in an instant. But Rome's political memory always preserved one dark shadow, Tarquinius Superbus, the last king. Roman tradition remembered him as the model of power that had burst beyond its limits, and his overthrow became the opening act of the Republic. From that point on, fear of tyranny was no longer only about one man. It became part of the Roman imagination of rule itself. That is why every form of over-concentrated power could summon an old shudder. Layers of control, parallel offices, and deliberately slow procedures did not come only from reason. They came from wounded memory. A community haunted by unlimited power will build its future around that fear. Many later republics would do the same. A scroll of parchment is unrolled. Its edge curls softly, as if it has already passed through many hands. In the room hangs the feeling that the past has not yet agreed to leave. Rome called that Vate Mos Maiorum, the custom of the ancestors. It was not a closed legal code. It was a set of things considered trustworthy because generations had kept, repeated, and handed them down. That is why a new decision, if it wanted to stand, usually had to lean on the voice of those who came before it, or at least pretend not to have broken too sharply from them. The power of Mos Maiorum lay in its ability to turn memory into a limit. It forced the new to ask permission of the old before stepping into the square. Once a community lets tradition judge the present, it preserves identity and raises a barrier against the intoxication of too rapid a change. On a stone bench, a few old lines can weigh more than all the new arguments spoken that day. That is why Rome fits so naturally with a way of reading law that always returned to the first question: what is being preserved here, and what must never be bent? Mos Maiorum lived by that spirit. It did not worship the past as a statue frozen in place. It used the past as a measure against which the present could be judged. That is why every major dispute in Rome was never only about advantage. It was about continuity, whether the community could still recognize itself in a new decision. At that point, law ceased to be mere wording. It became a battle over who had the right to interpret the soul of the shared order. Once text and ancestral memory enter the same argument, people are no longer debating correctness alone. The stone road runs straight toward the horizon. Those who walk it learn early that not every step upward in life is open to them. In that atmosphere, fate, was not simply a poetic notion. It was the way many Romans understood limits already assigned within life itself. Out of that came a distinct style of endurance. Do your part, carry your burden, and hold few illusions that the world will be gentle with everyone. Such a belief could make people tougher in hardship. But it could also make many conditions harder to change. If you were born on a lower step and taught all your life that this was the share you were meant to bear, then you would understand why many orders endure not only by pressure, but also by ideas that persuade people to fold themselves back into the place already marked out for them. A carved wheel turns endlessly in the imagination, reminding people that some things cannot be held for long, even when grasped tightly. Fortuna was the name the Romans gave to that uncertain element. She dispensed luck and misfortune, but also warned that success was never permanent property. In such a world, a wise ruler could not put faith only in the most beautiful plan. He had to make room for bad seasons, setbacks, unforeseen reversals, and the turn that comes from the place no one wants to watch. Rome revered Fortuna not because it loved surrender. It did so because it understood that the greater the power, the harder the fall if one imagines tomorrow already secured. A mature order does not live by the illusion of total control. It leaves space for what cannot be fully predicted. In a distant province, the emperor's statue casts a long shadow across the square. Faces that do not share a language can still raise their eyes toward the same image. That was the force of the imperial cult, reverence for the emperor as the focal point of loyalty. Rome ruled too many lands, customs, and gods to force everyone into sameness. What it needed was a symbol broad enough not to erase local identity, but strong enough to make every region remember where it belonged. The veneration of the emperor did exactly that. In one place, it took the form of an altar. In another, a feast day, a monument, or a prayer for the ruler's well-being. The forms varied, but the sense of convergence did not. Once power knows how to turn a person into a symbolic center, it enters public memory itself. The voting chamber is more enclosed. The crack of broken wax is quieter. Yet what is being decided is immense. After a ruler leaves life, will his memory be elevated or scraped away? Rome had two cold paths for the legacy of leadership. One was divus, formal deification after death. The other was damnatio memoriae, the erasure of memory, the stripping away of images, titles, and public traces from the surface of power. A state like that does not govern only the living. It governs the way posterity must remember the dead. That is the height of the power to define honor. The victor does not merely keep the throne. The victor keeps the right to adjust the light falling around that throne. And once collective memory is placed in the hands of politics, history ceases to be a safe refuge for truth. The cloak of the Pontifex Maximus falls across the emperor's shoulders, and in that moment the sword and sacred law stand closer together than ever before. In ancient Rome, the Pontifex Maximus was the highest office of the state religion. When Augustus and the emperors after him held that position themselves, the ruler no longer governed public affairs alone. He also became the highest face of sacred order. That gave the throne a different weight. Commands could emerge wrapped at once in religious aura and in the promise of peace. What later ages called the Pax Romana was therefore not maintained by military force alone. It was sustained by the feeling that order now had a ruler strong enough to bind law, ritual, and legitimacy into a single body. And from that height, every later crack would become more dangerous. Lamplight slowly begins to overpower the old smell of incense smoke. In the first chapels, a new order arrives not empty-handed, but carrying forward many of Rome's old rhythms of administration. Under Constantine, Christianity did not merely grow as a new faith. It also expanded through its ability to use the empire's networks of letters, rank, councils, and languages of legitimacy. From that point on, sacred authority no longer stood outside the ordering of common life. It moved through dioceses, doctrinal decisions, and an ever-tightening bond between throne and church. Rome changed its gods, but it did not abandon the habit of using belief to keep the crowd moving in a shared rhythm. The most durable orders rarely die outright. They change names, symbols, and keepers. In the public squares of any secular state, there are still moments that make crowds straighten their backs. Oaths, memorial days, symbols, moments of silence, phrases repeated like articles of faith. That is where civil religion appears. It does not demand that everyone kneel before one shared altar, but it creates a sacred zone for common life, a place where political values are clothed in ritual, memory, and reverence. If Pax Deorum once helped Rome preserve order by maintaining harmony with the gods, then in many later states public ceremony performs a closely related task. It binds loyalty to a story larger than any single person. Once belief is concentrated into symbol and rite, power no longer needs to raise its voice all the time. It only needs to make the crowd feel that something is being preserved as if it were sacred. A white dome rises against the sky. Columns cast long shadows. Cold stone speaks its own language without needing explanation. Neoclassical architecture understood something Rome had understood long before. Form can teach people how to look at power before they ever hear a speech. On Capitol Hill, that language was not accidental. Its design drew on ancient Greece and Rome in order to suggest the ideals that once guided a new republic. That is why the stone is not just material. It becomes a declaration that this power wishes to be seen as something above the individual, longer lasting than a single term, and serious enough to bear a common promise. Rome understood early that symbols do not exist merely to decorate. They are how power occupies the imagination before it secures consent. Wind moves through the ruins. Sunlight sweeps across cracked slabs of stone. What remains after temples fall is not only brick and marble, but an invisible compact made of law, discipline, ritual, memory, and the limits placed on ambition. Rome's physical empire is gone. Yet the way it used belief to defend legitimacy, symbols to secure loyalty, and ceremony to place power within form still supports later orders. From public oaths to the classical language of capital architecture, those echoes remain visible in modern life. That is why Rome refuses to die completely inside the political imagination of the West. And the final question still remains: what happens when that invisible compact can no longer hold those at the bottom? If you can still see the shadow of Rome in the world today, leave your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want to keep going with this series, peeling back the layers of ancient power that still echo into the present, be sure to subscribe so you do not miss the next chapter.